Welcome all. We are thrilled to have you here for our discussion with Eric Schoenberg on the future of media in an age of disruption. This is part of our Conversations at Graham series. And in this case, we are previewing a course that is going to be in the spring that you can go much deeper into if you're excited by the content of this conversation. My name is Seth Green, and on a morning like this one, I'm especially grateful to say that I'm the Dean of the Graham School here at the University of Chicago. And I'll welcome you to our gorgeous campus on this wintry day where we are finally coming out of the snow in Chicago. And I'll just mention that our spring course registration, which includes Eric's course, is now open. And we are very excited for you to join us, and in the chat, you'll see a registration link momentarily. We also have many other upcoming events in the next week on the arts, on designing a portfolio of wellness, and our first Friday lecture going deeper into Nietzsche and nihilism. But the reason you are here today is for a conversation with Eric. He is the former editor-in-chief and CEO of Inc. and Fast Company. He is now a leader of the Alliance for Trust in Media. And most importantly to us, he is a distinguished instructor of journalism here at the Graham School, where he will be continuing to teach a class on this subject of media, and in this case is going deep into media in an age of disruption. So, Eric, to set the table for the rest of our conversation, can you just give us a little bit of a snapshot of this course and why you're deciding to teach it? And then we'll dig into some of the content more directly.
Sure, Seth. Thank you for that introduction. And this is, by the way, the second course I've taught at the Graham School. The first was a wonderful course about media leading up to the 24 election. The press likes to think of itself as the fourth estate of government. And while that may be a little self-aggrandizing, it is actually a function that the press plays in holding power to account and giving voters the information they need to make decisions, hold the government accountable. It is no mistake that the press is the only industry that was singled out in the US Constitution for protection from government interference. So it's no secret that this industry is tremendously disrupted by technology, by changing attitudes in government towards a free press, and by actions within the press itself and shifting audience requirements. If you are going to understand how this hugely important institution works and where it's going to end up, which is certainly not where it has been, that's what this course is about. So I look forward to examining this together with the students and with a roster of speakers who are all experts on different aspects of the fourth estate.
Well, so what I'd love to do is dig in at a high level to the content, Eric, and really think about how media is changing, why, and where it's going. And so let's start with that, how it's changing. If you had to sum up how media has evolved, kind of from, let's say, the 70s, 80s, all the way to today, just give us a picture of that change from X to Y, and then we'll dig into the trend lines, the root causes, like what's happening to move us from one place to the other. But I'm curious just to start at the high level, like how is media different today than when you entered journalism?
Well, it is almost unrecognizable from when I entered journalism. There are, come on, the thing that is probably most obvious is the fragmentation of delivery of what people regard as news services. So, there were within living memory a period when there were only three broadcast networks and a couple of cable news stations, and some radio stations, all of whose licenses were controlled by government's control of radio spectrum. And then you got your news either from those sources or from your metropolitan newspaper. That has exploded into a kind of Cambrian evolution of podcasters and social media news delivery, and of course, an explosion also of cable TV. And all of this means that where we used to have a kind of highly filtered um, stream of news, we now have it coming to us from all sides, from the legacy media like the New York Times and NBC, but also from everyone's crazy uncle on Facebook and X and podcasts and TikTok and so forth. Um, the business model has also tremendously changed, and that also changes the way the news is delivered to you and the kind of news that you get. There was, when the advertising model ruled, it was important for big media organizations like the kind that I worked for to appeal to a broad range of people, consumers. And that meant that the news could not be polarized, that there was a kind of narrow window of what was considered newsworthy. Now you can make a very good living with a highly polarized, highly partisan news feed. There's no accountability for whether the news you deliver is true or not. There's no penalty to pay for making stuff up. And so there's this kind of constant battle between um, news organizations that have standards and those that don't. And I think it's very important to be able to understand the different incentives that drive the kind of news that's delivered to you, the different platforms that are now available to you, and also to acquire a certain amount of skill at distinguishing what's reliable and what isn't, um, based on not only on the performance of the newsrooms, but also understanding how you consume news and what your goals are and what the mental shortcuts you might be using to determine what's true.
I want to dig in a bit to how this transformation happens, because one part of it I think is probably very visible above the surface, which is technology has changed. Obviously, it's much less expensive to communicate an idea through platforms in 2025 than it was in 1980. And so, that at least accounts for part of the proliferation, is that you have many more medium and technology platforms that allow you to do this. But another piece of it, which maybe is less visible to people that are not in the industry, Eric, is the business model change. And they're obviously related, but they also have their own ways of working themselves out in terms of their impacts on journalism. Can you talk a bit about the evolution of that business model? You already referenced from an ad world where you're trying to get broad appeal now to fragmentation, meaning that maybe your best bet is to get a niche and really go deep with them. Talk about that evolution and then talk a bit more about what it means, because I think we don't always appreciate how many of the things we see in society, like polarization, may be partly reflective of this business environment and how it's reshaping the way that we consume information.
That is a really good point, Seth. Just to talk about the sort of lowering of the barriers to entry here. I mean, all of us now carry effectively a television studio in our pocket or our purse, and that just adds to the flood of sometimes contradictory information about what's really true. But to focus on your question about the business model, when I started, the the advertising model was an exchange between um, an institution that provided a publisher that provided news and another institution that provided advertising on behalf of brands that wanted to advertise. The what was important at say the New York Times or the places I worked at Time Inc., like Fortune Magazine and Money and Inc. and Fast Company, was what the institutional brand of the publisher meant. So if you were an advertiser who, to go back to Inc., that wanted to reach entrepreneurs, you found a publication that spoke to them and you advertised in those pages. And it was an exchange, but specifically between a brand that wanted to advertise and a brand that delivered news. That was exploded by the creation of something called programmatic advertising. So just to give you a kind of case study example, let's say you're scrolling through TikTok and you come across an ad for an Apple Watch. In the old days, if that ad appeared on Fortune or on Inc., you would rightly assume that Apple had made a deal with the publisher to run an ad to reach its audience. With programmatic advertising, what really happened was that when you scrolled up and got to an ad space on TikTok, a signal went out to a supply side digital provider saying that someone is about to look at an ad space. What am I bid for that person's attention? And because it's TikTok, it has a lot of data about who that person is. So let's say, a grad student at the University of Chicago is about to look at an ad. What am I bid for that space? In our example, Apple won the bidding, and so an ad appears on the TikTok advertising space. That happens in a fraction of a second. So you're not even aware of it. That means a couple of things for the delivery of news in this information environment. For one thing, it means that publishing brands don't matter so much anymore. What matters is who is coming up to that vacant ad space. So an advertiser using this ad tech technology can follow you around the internet or social media anywhere. It doesn't matter if you're on TikTok or on Inc. or on the New York Times or on an ISIS recruiting site. All the advertising machinery now cares about is who you are and its ability to reach you. That obviously explodes the business model of an institution that tried to build its reputation as being the spokesperson for a particular kind of reader, or being the spokesperson for people in a particular region, like your metropolitan newspaper. So if you're a car dealership and you want to advertise the people in Des Moines, you would in the past have wanted to go to the Des Moines Register. Now, all you need to do is find people from Des Moines, wherever they happen to be on the web, and you can serve them up an ad. Another thing that happens is that the reputation of the publisher no longer matters. So it does not matter to Apple. Apple, in fact, probably has no way of knowing where its ads show up in real time. So it could be a site that Apple would be appalled to know that its ads were appearing next to that content. In fact, that happens all the time. And brands are continually embarrassed by where their ads show up. But it does mean that you don't have to be a respectable publisher to be able to make quite a bit of money in today's information environment.
Well, and so just think about that transformation, because you go from a place where that brand really matters. One of your goals in media is build this credibility, have trust, show people that you can be balanced, have companies feel like, okay, I can align myself with this brand, to a world where brand is getting more and more meaningless. All you're aiming toward is eyeballs on the page because that gets the ad. Even when it does show up embarrassingly, people know Apple didn't really intend this, so it doesn't have much impact on their brand, because even though it might be embarrassing if it were strategic, it's not, and we all know it now. And so it ends up having very little impact, even though we might believe that it should, right? So that's the world we operate in. And then we think about, well, then what is media going to be rewarded for? And to the obvious point here, it's eyeballs that can be then consumed by that ad space. And so I know even at the most respected newspapers, I have friends who write for them, and they tell me now they get back on their writing, they get back at the end of the month information on how many eyeballs their different stories collected, and they're encouraged to get more eyeballs, and they know that if they want to get more eyeballs, they have to say things that are more sensational. They have to write about subjects that are more polarizing, because that's the media environment in which people are now competing, right? And so it totally changes the whole incentive structure of media. And I mean, I want to get into this because it's coming up in the chat a lot. It's even changing the legacy publishers. And you've looked at some of this research over time. And I thought The Economist had a really interesting piece about a year ago where they even looked at, for example, the New York Times, and how in their study, the New York Times had always been pretty careful when they used certain descriptors, that those descriptors were generally without a politics to them. And in the last decade had become much more likely to use descriptors that align with a particular party. For example, when they described immigrants, they would use undocumented versus illegal because that was a word that was appropriate and their readers might react less. And it was a world in which it's a different subject. And so could you just talk about how that is changing media, including even our legacy brands, and how your research, which I have seen in the past, is showing now that media has moved away from the center in some ways in both directions?
That's right. People are now searching out news platforms where they find agreement. So confirmation bias has replaced trust, I suppose, or it's become perhaps in many people's minds synonymous with trust when it comes to the media platforms that they consume. Some of the data that I have found is that if you measure the extreme language of a particular politician, even in the New York Times, you will find that that politician gets far more coverage than the moderates. So there is not just in the choice of words by the writers or the columnists at an institution like the Times, but who they decide to cover, who they give the most airtime to, is also driven by the same forces that are polarizing us politically. The idea that you have to compete for eyeballs is a pressure that has kind of always been there, but it is totally intensified by digital delivery mechanisms, which can count eyeballs, to the fraction, to the unit, rather than say, a page in a magazine or a page or a 30-second spot on television where it wasn't necessarily clear who was watching. But now those eyeballs can be identified to actually the possessor of the eyeballs. And so the pressure to compete for them is just intense. It
Well, and then,
requires, as a result, just a kind of rededication to public service on the part of journalists that is hard to, um, well, that requires sort of a different incentive structure. And as a result, and I think this is maybe where you're going, Seth, is that a whole bunch of other business models have arisen. So there's been a flowering of local news sites that are not for profit, that are driven by um, donations, subscriptions, often by wealthy individuals in that community, or even on the national scene. Jeff Bezos, as the owner of the Washington Post, is an obvious example, but there are many others. Mark Benioff, as the owner of Time Magazine, and so on. So the media industry is in this period of searching for what can sustain it and how it can fulfill the mission that it has traditionally had of being the fourth estate.
so you're going to explore all of this in your course, Eric, and I just want to give a little bit more detail about that course because I think this is such a fascinating topic. And even though you are an incredible guide and will be leading the course, you are not going to be the lone expert bringing insights. You are interviewing quite a number of extraordinary people from really across the different media forms. So I know you have the former editor-in-chief of Glamour magazine, you have academic leaders, you even have some of the people that are now influencers who are part of that social media that is dominant for the people in their 20s in terms of where they consume news. And then you have people that are looking at all of these trends, like the current president of the Pew Research Center. Can you just talk a little bit about the course and how you're bringing in all of these industry experts and thought leaders around this topic to really deepen our understanding of how
Sure.
media is acting?
Sure. Um, I've broken the course into um, classes that I think cover some of the most important trends for people to know about. So the first class is an overview about how we got where we are in the media industry, how it is different. And for that, I'm looking at speakers like Stephen Adler, who is the head of Reuters and is now at the Columbia Journalism School, who's obviously a multiple award winner, head of the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press, someone who has an extraordinary overview of the media industry and its future. Um, the president of Pew Research, will then follow up in the next week's class to tell us actually where people are getting their news and what that means for our future. Another aspect that is very important for our democracy and for understanding media is what's happened to local news. That has been perhaps the hardest hit. Those small city and smaller community news organizations are reeling. We lose probably 25 news institutions per week. And
Wow.
there are now um, news deserts across America where there is no local news at all. And people either default to social media or to highly polarized national stations. And so there, the leader of the local news initiative at the Medill School, Mackenzie Warren, will be our speaker. I think another important thing is to talk about what we are all doing when we consume news. I mean, what is it that we're looking for? What are the um, mental shortcuts that we may be using? How are we determining what to believe, where to place our trust, and are we doing a good job of that? I think it's a mistake that many people make, especially people who get a lot of their news from social media, to think that truthful news will find you. It will show up in your news feed. Actually, that's not the way algorithms work on social media. And the role of being an informed consumer now is a bit of an effort. We'll follow up then with talk about the business models. And there we have the CEO of Time Magazine, Jess Sibley, who will talk about how an organization like Time that is still highly influential. You can see the fact that the news ripples that come out from who's on the cover of Time magazine most recently, um, Elon Musk, and how that institution is surviving. And then we'll meet some influencers. So people that, if you're of my generation, you may have never heard of, but who have subscriptions that are multiple times the size of the circulation of the most respected institutions in the mainstream press. Um, I don't think we can get through a class like this without also talking about the effect of artificial intelligence. And there we have the head of partnerships for one of the leading artificial intelligence foundational models, which is Perplexity, Jessica Chan. And then we'll wind up with a panel. We'll have a representative from traditional media, Cindy Levy, the former editor-in-chief of Glamour, Tom Rosenstiel, the University of Maryland professor whose sole study is the future of media, and then Richard Gringras of Google. Google has done so much both to um, destroy the traditional business model, but also has been charged by his company to help rebuild and is funding an awful lot of these new innovations in the media industry that everyone should know about. So that's a breakdown of the course. And the speakers I agree with you. They're tremendously influential people within their industry, and they could not be more knowledgeable.
Well, I have to say, I'm so proud to have this course at the Graham School. I think the topic you're investigating is one of the most important for anyone that cares about learning and democracy and the issues that we care about here at the Graham School. I also think the way you're investigating it, really looking at all of the different perspectives, including really engaging with the world that is becoming dominant, the influencers and these other factors, right? Instead of just bemoaning, we're going to talk with them. We're going to look at the possibilities. I mean, I think the reality is we're not going back. So the question becomes, what are the possibilities out there? And that's where your engagement with these models, like a nonprofit media, and thinking about, what is the role of media and what should be the business model? I mean, these strike me as some of the most important questions of our time, in that information is fundamental to the democratic experience and to citizenship and to all of our lives, whether it's in business or in personal lives. And then how do we actually develop a world in the current, with AI and technology and all these things, where we can continue to seek truth successfully and share in a common reality, right? And so, anyway, I just think that most important question, some of the most important people around it, We're thrilled to have you leading this course. I have one more question, then we're going to come to all the questions that are lighting up the chat, which is
Sure.
just talk a little bit about how the course actually takes place. You have these speakers, you share your insights, but then you also break out into small groups and allow people to talk with one another, which is a core of the Graham experience. Do you want to just describe the classroom that you've endeavored?
Sure. So the model has been to look at the opening part of the of each class is to review what the reading was for the previous week, which is basically something that happened in real time in the media that reflects on the topic of the class. So we'll talk about that, and then bring in a speaker who is an expert in that, who can uh, add color and depth of knowledge to the topic. And then there will be plenty of time for Q&A from the students with that expert as well. And that has been, in my previous experience, Seth, something that both the expert and the students have enjoyed. And then finally, we'll wrap up with breakout sessions in which people can share their reactions and then bring it home and get ready for the next week.
All right, well, let's jump into the questions that are coming from our lifelong learning community. Karen mentions the Associated Press is suing the White House over access to events. I'm sure you're familiar that after they decided to continue referring to the Gulf of Mexico, they were banned. Is this suit unprecedented? Does it have a chance to be successful in your perspective? And is there broader learning or meaning that we can take away from this example?
There was going to be a clash between the White House and the traditional media over something. It's kind of humorous that it is over the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America. Um, but this is where the battle lines were drawn. I can't think of a time when this happened and over the wording of a particular thing. Also, we've never had a president who tried to rename an international body of water before. I don't know how it will actually shake out. And you can see in the right-wing press that the explanation, the kind of backfill about what is going on here is not just about the naming of that body of water, but also about the kind of word choices that the AP has uh, kind of insinuated into into the lexicon of newsrooms around the country because of its highly influential style guide. And Seth alluded to that earlier on in our session today about the language that's used by various publications and what that says to you about their political leaning. You know, I don't know what power the Associated Press has to compel the White House to allow them in, and there are organizations, of course, that are excluded. But I think this has tremendous implications. The Associated Press is really makes an effort to be straight down the middle and kind of more important for the information environment as a whole. The Associated Press supplies local news with their national and international coverage. And if that is compromised by this feud over the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, then all of media, and especially local media, will suffer.
We have a question from Fred Boltler who says part of the challenge is an erosion of trust in professional journalism. Obviously, this is something that you work a lot on, Eric. He
Yes.
also points out in a similar way, there is reduced trust in science, in government, in the Constitution. I mean, you look at trust studies, and basically, all of these institutions that once commanded, 90+% of trust, higher education being another, we're now, in the 50s or below. And if you then look into why, it's because only one group with a certain political view might still have trust and another group might not. And so, talk a little bit about where we are in journalism from a trust perspective and where we go from here, because in one sense, this is somewhat specific to journalism, right? There are elements here. In another sense, in a world, to the point we made earlier, where everyone, including your uncle, is a main news source, and there's not necessarily a veracity to everything that's said, right? It might be that the new normal is just that we are going to live in a less trusting society because there is abundant information and statements, and it's very hard for an individual to tell which ones are true and not. And so, even though you might expect the natural response over time would be that those that actually are factual would get more credibility and regain, I mean, that's not where I see the cards moving at the moment because, there's a lot of evidence psychologically. If you repeat something, whether that is true or not, it actually sticks based on its repetition, not based on its veracity. And so just talk a little bit about trust, how you think about it, and where you see both the challenges and opportunities for journalism.
Well, I would say that institutional journalism has indeed lost a lot of trust. That's obvious from the data, and you're right, Seth, that this is not limited to journalism alone. And yet, you may decide that you no longer trust the New York Times, say, but you can't be alive in this modern era without trusting someone. So it's not a question of there is no trust. It's just where are you going to spend it? Trust is, basically the act of making yourself vulnerable to the information you get from somebody else. If you're going to act on um, the information you get about public health, about vaccines, um, you're putting your health at risk. And whether you get that information from RFK Jr. or from the CDC could have really important implications for your health. So I think the question is not, you know, I'm going to withdraw all trust. That's not actually possible. It's how do I become more discriminating about where I give that trust. And so that will be one of the things that we'll cover. We'll have Dana Gall-Young from the University of Delaware to help us with that, psychology and journalism professor there. And so I think that is the question. The trend right now is to lower trust in all kinds of expertise. I think there's a pendulum swing here. And I think that I think in the real world, we understand that there really is a difference between someone who spent 20 years practicing medicine and 7 years in med school before that in the quality of advice they give versus an influencer on TikTok. And eventually, I think as you learn to think critically about the information you get, that you'll be able to assemble a source of trusted messengers that are truly reliable.
Stephen Pravasnik asked, did the FCC change in 1987 abolishing the fairness doctrine set the stage for transformation of business model that you explained? Another big law, Eric, is when, media like Google and, at the time, this is before Facebook, the precursor, but when they were coming into the world, they have a legal decision or legislative decision where they basically say these are content neutral, so they don't have the same obligations as, for example, the New York Times. If something shows up that's libelous or things like that, they're not responsible in the same way. And talk a little bit address this 1987 change, but talk a little bit more broadly. How has policy shaped where we are today and shaped the business model development? Because I think it's an interesting question. My understanding is we're a little bit different from Europe in the way that we treat some of these things as just a comparative study.
That is true. So you're referring to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act from the 1990s. One thing you could say about both of those changes, those regulatory and legislative changes, is that the law of unintended consequences always applies. So the fairness doctrine was not sustainable in a changing information environment, even back in 1987. So the government's power to enforce the Fairness Doctrine was granted because of the government's control over the broadband spectrum and broadcast spectrum. And as cable media arose, let alone social media, the government's jurisdiction over that failed. So it kind of was hampering broadcast media in a way that sort of was not sustainable. Um, it would be nice if some kind of fairness doctrine or um, veracity doctrine were reinstated, but I don't think that's very, very likely. We can talk about Europe in a second. Um, with Section 230, there the absolving social media platforms of any kind of liability for what's posted on the sites, especially if it's done by users, was determined to be necessary for the growth of the internet. And it worked in the sense that the internet grew, but it did mean that platforms could become, for lack of a un for lack of a more neutral term, cesspools, many of them, of false information and hate speech. And because of programmatic advertising, that does not destroy their business model necessarily. And um, that is also a difficult one to change because even though there is pressure in government to do that, but now the internet platforms have become so powerful that their lobbying efforts can stall that. One aspect of this is Section 230 does not apply to artificial intelligence and the information that those models generate. So that is a lever that still exists for regulation of artificial intelligence if we have the political will to apply it. In Europe, the Digital Services Act does require large platforms to adhere to certain standards. And the question there is whether the EU has the political will to stand up to people and like Elon Musk or organizations like Facebook, and that has not been demonstrated. But it does offer, I think, an example of what could happen. But again, these organizations are now so powerful that I believe that for the foreseeable future, we are going to be in charge of our own information environment, that we have to create an information microclimate, if you will, around ourselves using our own powers of perception and discretion to do the best job we can at getting at the truth.
Well, so Eric, I want to go deeper into that question because we have a question here that comes from Barbara Samaglio. It takes much more work today to identify trusted sources. What does this imply for the average person trying to remain informed?
The analogy that I often use is that consuming news right now is like using email. And you know, perhaps by heart experience, that when you get an email from a Nigerian prince who is going to share his fortune with you, if all you have to do is turn over your bank account number, that is not real. If you could use that same power of critical thinking to your news feed, you would have a much better idea of what is true. It is definitely more work, just as it's more work um, to filter out the stuff that comes across your email feed. This is just what it's like to live in the 21st century. There are many conveniences that email and social media provide, and digital news, even from uh, trusted institutions. But it comes with a downside, and there is more work. I think that this is just part of being a citizen in the 21st century.
So we have a couple questions in the chat, Eric, about the future. And one of them asks about whether or not these growing nonprofit models actually are more balanced and are able to push past the polarization. Curious if you can comment on that. And then a broader question from Rob Mann about, okay, given all of these changes, where are we headed and what is the future of the institution of media. So maybe you can think about the big picture question of the future, but include in that a little bit of analysis on what we're seeing out of these more early examples of some of the nonprofit forms, including here in Chicago, where we have Chicago Public Media.
Um, that Obviously this is a focus of my own not-for-profit, the Alliance for Trust in Media, and I would say that not-for-profit media works best when it is focused on a particular outcome that can be supported by philanthropy. So a couple of examples. One you mentioned is Chicago Public Media, where people in the community are helping to support uh, nonpartisan and reliable information about Chicago and Chicago environs. And that is the model that you see play out across the country in local news environments. The Texas Tribune would be another one for the state of Texas. Um, Cal Matters for California. Another model that works with not-for-profit, with a not-for-profit business model would be investigative journalism, which has never paid off, even for institutions that would sort of subsidize it from the money they made doing sports and talk shows and things like that. So ProPublica or Spotlight PA or other organizations like that that really whose main business is accountability journalism. So, in the long run, I do think that not-for-profit uh, and contributions from in philanthropy is just one of many revenue streams that media will need to cash in on to survive and be sustainable, and hopefully a diminishing one over time as people realize that the value they get from reliable journalism is worth paying for. Um, to answer the question about media in general, I would say I don't know. And I think that this is something that we will discover as we go ahead. One thing is clear, that we're not going back to um, the simple world of three broadcast networks and your metropolitan paper. But I also have a lot of faith in people's desire to find out what's true, or at least, if not that, at least not to be fooled.
Right?
That no one, Democrat or Republican, Independent, MAGA or progressive, wants to be a patsy. And I think that when you acquire the skills to get at the truth, and if you do this in good faith, understanding that's like, no institution, no delivery of news is perfect, and take responsibility for being the arbiter of your own truthful news feed, that force will become something that brings uh, news media back to the level of trust and respect that is kind of implied by a democracy.
And we have a question from Susan Lyons about the legal cases that are now coming around media. In her example, she talks about consumer privacy that attempt to fight big tech and media algorithms and protect an individual's right to privacy. So I'll lay that on the table. Let me just also lay simultaneously, there's been a lot of other cases where media companies have been potentially liable for misinformation. I'm thinking of Fox, but also recently ABC settling
Mhm.
with Trump. So can you just talk about how the law may play a role and if it can be a successful lever potentially in addressing some aspects of the misinformation?
Yes, it can be. It can also, as you noted, Seth, be weaponized against media. Um, just to comment on the cases that you mentioned, the ABC basically settling that libel suit, which many legal scholars said ABC could have won. There's a similar one at play with CBS, which is uh, as a libel case, it's even more far-fetched. Um, in those cases, the broadcast station, the broadcast network is owned by a larger organization that has to do business with the government on many different fronts, and media is a small part of the business. ABC is owned by Disney, for example, and um, the and the Washington Post is owned by Amazon, and so on. And so the corporate needs have outweighed the institutional journalism integrity there, and that is very alarming, and it speaks to a kind of um, authoritarian playbook that we've seen play out in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, for example, and in Turkey, where the ruling powers use the law and financial pressure to um, quiet their critics in the press and stifle the exercise of independent press. Uh, my my hope is that um, owners of media companies with a spine will stand up for the First Amendment. The libel suits that are commanding a lot of attention right now, like ABC and CBS, um, are are ridiculous under ruling standards like the New York Times versus Sullivan, which say that newsrooms are not liable, and we're talking about public figures unless the public figure can prove actual malice, and that doesn't seem to be have been played a role in ABC or in the CBS thing. Um, but you know, the law is not the only factor here, and financial pressure, particularly in a government that has indicated that it is going to use um, financial pressure and favoritism to place a thumb on the scale of business decisions, regulatory decisions. It's a really difficult challenge for a media executive who has shareholders to answer to.
We are at time, Eric, but let me just come to one last question in the chat. When you think about where we are, what gives you the greatest hope? Like, where do you see the greatest bright spot in trying to move toward a media environment that would fulfill our goals as, citizens who want accurate information on which to base decision making?
Well, one of them is what I mentioned before, is that I think people are gravitate towards what really describes the reality that they live in, and they do not want to be taken advantage of. And so, in the end, um, truth, reality, has a tremendous advantage over misinformation. Misinformation does not describe the world. Misinformation does not support your interests. And in the long run, it is a very, very fragile foundation on which to build, a media industry or a government. Um, you know, the, uh, the I when I reflect on this, I think about kind of stories from history or from fairy tales. So there is the Emperor's New Clothes, that when you point out that something that people have been misinformed about is not true, and it is obviously not true, the falsehood collapses. We saw that in that fairy tale, but also we saw that in reality in the fall of Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Everybody understood that the workers of the world were not united behind the communist rulers of East Germany and Czechoslovakia uh, and Hungary. And when the when the momentum shifted towards truth away from government propaganda, it collapsed. And when that happens, the organizations that have stood for truth in spite of that will be elevated. So that is sort of the hopeful environment that I see.
Well, that reminds me of, I think, one of the most powerful writings that I've ever read, which is Václav Havel. And, his description of living in that time and seeing the signs "Workers of the World Unite," but realizing that that was not what was taking place, and finally coming to terms with the disconnect between what was said and what was reality, and how to move forward. So we'll use that as a hopeful ending to a very tricky challenge. I could not imagine a better guide to a more important issue. Thank you for teaching at the Graham School, Eric. Thank you for bringing this topic to the fore. And we look forward enthusiastically and gratefully to your class. And we'll follow up with everyone here so that if you're interested in taking it, you'll have the information on which to do so. I know class is filling up quickly. Thank you all.
Sure.
Have a great rest of your day. And thank you, Eric.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Seth, and thank you everyone for listening in.
Bye.